The auditorium was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made every breath and every heartbeat feel like it was echoing across the room. Sundar Pichai walked onto the stage slowly, not rushing, not pretending to be larger than life. He was dressed simply, his shoulders slightly bent as if he was still the same boy who had walked through narrow streets in Chennai years ago, holding a notebook filled with his dreams. He stood in front of the audience, his eyes steady but soft, and the very first words that came from his mouth caught everyone off guard. "I would not be standing here if she had not chosen to lose everything for me." The words hung in the air. The audience leaned in, waiting, wondering who he meant. Sundar's wife, Anjali, had always remained in the background of his public life. People had read small details about her, maybe seen her in a photograph, but very few knew the real story. And now here was Sundar, standing under the bright lights, willing to reveal something that would shake not only the room but the millions who would eventually hear it. He took a pause, the kind of pause that is not empty but filled with something larger, a memory too heavy to place into a sentence. His fingers brushed against the podium, not as a nervous habit but as if grounding himself before he opened a door to the past. Back then, he said, life had not been simple. He remembered the days in India when his family lived in a modest home, when the idea of making a phone call was a luxury, and electricity could disappear without warning. He remembered studying by the dim light, not complaining because dreams have a way of shining brighter than the lamps that fail. Sundar told the crowd how his parents had taught him humility and patience, how they worked hard without ever asking the world for applause. But there was another story, one that belonged not to his parents, but to the woman who would one day become his wife. Sundar's voice softened when he spoke of Anjali. They had first met at the Indian Institute of Technology. There was nothing dramatic about it at first. No firework display or dramatic twist. It was two young people sitting in a classroom, exchanging quiet smiles and occasional conversations, slowly discovering that kindness can be louder than confidence. Yet even in those early days there was something about her, something in the way she believed in him without needing evidence, something in the way she could listen without judgment, as if she already knew the storms he would one day face. But what the audience did not know, and what Sundar now began to reveal, was how much she had risked for him. There was a time, he said, when his dream of studying abroad felt impossible. The financial burden was enormous, and even if by some miracle he secured a scholarship, the emotional weight of leaving everything behind was unbearable. Sundar admitted he had considered giving up, staying back, taking a job that was safe and predictable, a life that would not shake the ground beneath their feet. But Anjali had looked him in the eye and told him that if he gave up on his dream, a part of him would slowly die. The audience held its breath. Sundar's voice trembled slightly, though not with weakness but with the truth of a memory that still burned. Anjali had been offered her own opportunities. She could have chosen a different city, a different path, one where her career might have flourished independently, but she turned them down. She gave up her own comfort, her own stability, her own rising future because she saw something in Sundar that he sometimes struggled to see in himself. She believed in the boy who stared at the metal of a rotary phone in awe, memorizing phone numbers because the family could not afford to buy more than one call. She believed that this boy, who carried dreams larger than his circumstances, deserved a chance to walk into the world and change it. And so, she waited. She waited through the long nights when Sundar was away. She waited through letters that traveled oceans, through moments when uncertainty was heavier than hope. Sundar confessed that there were nights when he almost broke down, nights when he questioned if the sacrifices were worth it. But in every letter from Anjali there was only one message: keep going because the world has not yet seen the man I see. The auditorium was no longer silent. The audience shifted, some leaning forward with tears in their eyes, others trying to hide the lump in their throats. Sundar's story was no longer about a CEO, no longer about success, but about the quiet, unseen power of resilience, love, and faith. He described the day when he finally received the acceptance letter from Stanford. The joy was overwhelming, but the shadow of the cost was heavier. He had worried about the money, about leaving his family behind, about what it would mean for Anjali. He had almost torn the letter apart, ready to walk away. But then, in one phone call, she told him something that would stay with him forever. "If you don't take this chance, Sundar, I will never forgive you. Not because you would disappoint me, but because you would betray yourself." Those words had carried him across the ocean. Those words had followed him when he struggled in a new country, when loneliness gnawed at him, when doubt whispered that he did not belong. And those words carried him still years later, even as he stood on one of the grandest stages in the world. The crowd was captivated, but Sundar wasn't finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, his eyes glistening not with pride but with something more fragile, more human. He said that everything people admired about his journey, the rise, the achievements, the recognition, could never be separated from the sacrifices of the woman who had chosen to walk beside him. Then he stopped, and his silence became sharper than any sentence. The audience waited, sensing something heavier was coming, something he had never shared before. Sundar looked down, inhaled deeply, and then said softly, "But what I did not know then, what she never told me, was that her sacrifice came at a cost so deep I could not see it until it was too late." The audience froze. A ripple of tension swept across the room. Sundar's face revealed pain that words could not hide, and just as he was about to continue, the lights flickered slightly, almost as if the universe itself hesitated, and then, with a voice that was both fragile and steady, Sundar said, "The night before I left, Anjali told me something I will never forget, and what she said changed everything I thought I knew about love, sacrifice, and dreams." And with that, Sundar's voice stopped. The screen behind him turned black. The part of the story that no one expected was about to begin. The black screen behind him lingered like a heavy curtain, and for a moment the audience wondered if this was intentional, if Sundar wanted them to sit with the weight of what he had just said. In that silence there was unease, the kind that makes people hold their breath because they sense that what is about to come next will be difficult to hear. Then slowly his voice returned, softer now, almost breaking, as if he was not just speaking to the audience but reliving the moment himself. He said that the night before he boarded the plane to America, he had gone to meet Anjali one last time. It was not in a fancy restaurant or a well-decorated home, but on a simple street corner where the city lights flickered like tired stars. They both stood there, neither speaking much at first, both knowing that words often fail when the heart is too full. Sundar remembered how he could barely look into her eyes because he knew leaving would wound her. And yet he also knew that not leaving would wound the future they both dreamed of. Anjali broke the silence first. Her voice was steady, but beneath that steadiness was something she did not want him to notice. She told him, "I will wait for you, Sundar. I will not ask for promises. I will not demand timelines. I will not hold you back. But I need you to know one thing. The day you stop believing in yourself, the day you let fear become stronger than hope, that will be the day you lose me." Her words struck him like thunder in the quiet night. Sundar had always known she believed in him, but to hear her attach her own life, her own love, to the condition of his resilience was something he had not expected. It was not a threat, not anger, but a declaration that she was willing to give everything as long as he never betrayed the dream she had chosen to protect. In that moment, he realized that she was not only sacrificing her career and her present life, she was tying her own happiness to the fire inside him, trusting that he would never let it burn out. Sundar confessed to the audience that as he boarded the plane, those words followed him more closely than his suitcase. In the loneliness of a foreign land, when nights felt endless and days felt heavier than stone, he would hear her voice echo, "Don't let fear win." When he struggled to pay rent, when he doubted if he truly belonged among people who seemed far more privileged, he would close his eyes and see her face lit by the dim streetlight, reminding him that failure was not just about him anymore. It would mean breaking the faith of someone who had surrendered her own path for his. He paused again, and the auditorium felt the sting of his vulnerability. This was not the polished narrative of a tech giant. This was not the story of a man climbing ladders with ease. This was the confession of someone who had almost fallen many times, but was held up by a quiet force unseen by the world. Sundar's voice thickened as he admitted something he had rarely shared. There were nights in America when he wrote letters to Anjali that he never sent, because in those letters he confessed how close he was to giving up. He didn't want her to know, didn't want to weaken the foundation of her belief, so he locked those words away. But life has a way of testing even the strongest faith. There came a period when months passed without them being able to meet. Their only connection was through occasional phone calls, which were expensive and short, or through letters that arrived late and sometimes not at all. Sundar admitted that during one of those long gaps he received a letter from Anjali that shook him deeply. In that letter she did not write of encouragement. She did not remind him to push harder. Instead, she wrote something that frightened him. "Sometimes I wonder if you will come back at all, or if the world will take you so far away that I will no longer recognize the man I once knew." His heart had stopped when he read that. For the first time he realized that her sacrifice had a shadow, a loneliness that consumed her silently while she tried to keep smiling. She had given up her comfort and her career, but now it was her heart that was carrying the heaviest burden. Sundar admitted that guilt pierced him like a knife. He began to question whether his dream was costing too much, not just for him, but for the woman who was waiting, holding her breath, hoping that distance would not erase the bond they had built. The audience listened in silence, some nodding as if they too had known the pain of distance, the cost of chasing something that demanded too much. Sundar lifted his gaze slowly, his voice breaking for the first time on stage as he said, "She never told anyone about her struggles. She let the world think she was fine. But inside, she was fighting battles no one saw, and all of it was for me." Then, as if the story was still too raw to share all at once, Sundar took a step back from the microphone. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, there was a fire in his expression that had not been there before. He said that one night, during those early years, he made a decision that would change not only his relationship but his entire approach to life. And just as he began to reveal what that decision was, his voice dropped to a near whisper, pulling every person in the room closer. "I realized that if I continued the way I was, I might win the dream but lose the person who gave me the strength to chase it. So I made a choice that night. But that choice, it almost destroyed everything." He stopped there, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. The cliffhanger hung in the air like a storm about to break. The silence stretched as Sundar's last words lingered in the room. People leaned forward in their seats, restless, needing to know what kind of choice could be so dangerous. What kind of decision could threaten to undo a bond built on love, sacrifice, and years of waiting? Sundar finally lifted his eyes, and when he spoke, his tone had changed. It was no longer steady or calm. It was raw, stripped of every layer of polish, like a man confessing something he had carried in secret for far too long. He told them that in those days of endless pressure, he convinced himself that perhaps the best way to protect Anjali was to let her go. He reasoned that if she was free, she could rebuild her life without the burden of waiting for him, without the pain of distance, without the uncertainty of whether his dreams would ever bring them closer again. To Sundar it seemed like an act of kindness, but in truth, it was an act of fear. Fear of failing her, fear of watching her faith slowly shatter, fear of being the reason her future crumbled. So one evening, sitting in the small apartment he rented with borrowed money, he wrote her a letter. It was not filled with warmth or encouragement, but with cold, deliberate words that cut deeper than he realized. In that letter, he told Anjali she should move on, that she should not tie her life to him anymore, that maybe she deserved someone who could give her more certainty, more stability, more presence. He wrote that he would always care for her, but that caring from afar was not enough to keep her whole. When Sundar paused to drink water, the auditorium was utterly still. He looked at the crowd and admitted that even as he sealed that letter, his hand shook. Every fiber of him resisted. But his mind convinced him that sacrifice sometimes meant breaking the very bond that had carried him so far. He mailed the letter, and in that moment he believed he had done the right thing. But what he did not expect was her reply. Weeks later, a thin envelope arrived in his mailbox. His hands trembled as he opened it, and inside, in her familiar handwriting, were words that burned into him more fiercely than anything he had ever read. Anjali did not beg. She did not plead, and she did not cry on paper. Instead, she wrote with the clarity of someone who had already made her decision long ago. She told him, "Sundar, you can try to let me go, but I will not let you go. I did not give up everything so that you could protect me from pain. I chose this path because I believe in the man you will become, and if you think you can push me away with a letter, then you still do not understand how deeply I have tied my life to yours." The audience gasped quietly. Sundar's voice broke as he recalled how in that same letter, she wrote one final line that would follow him for the rest of his life. "If you want to end us, you will have to look me in the eyes and say it, because I will not accept anything less than the truth." His throat tightened as he admitted he cried that night. Not silent tears, but the kind that come when the weight of guilt and love collide. When you realize that someone has more courage to fight for you than you have to fight for yourself. Sundar confessed he had never felt so small, yet so deeply loved all at once. But the story did not stop there. Sundar explained that after receiving her letter, he knew he could no longer run from the responsibility of her sacrifice. He vowed to himself that if she was strong enough to stand beside him even in his weakest moment, then he would be strong enough to endure every trial, every doubt, and every obstacle that came his way. Yet life was not finished testing them. Not long after, Sundar's student visa faced complications, and for months he lived with the uncertainty of whether he would even be allowed to continue his studies. During that period, he isolated himself, terrified that the dream might end abruptly, leaving him with nothing but regret. It was then that Anjali, thousands of miles away, made a decision of her own, one that shocked him and nearly turned his world upside down. Sundar looked at the crowd, his eyes glistening as he lowered his voice to almost a whisper. She did something I never expected, something that no one knew until now, and when I found out, I didn't know whether to feel gratitude or heartbreak. The room seemed to shrink as everyone leaned forward, desperate to hear what he meant. Sundar's voice trembled with emotion as he prepared to reveal the choice his wife had made, one that would test the very foundation of their love. And then he stopped. The lights dimmed slightly, and Sundar's last words of part 3 left the audience suspended in unbearable anticipation. She made a sacrifice so great that it left me questioning whether I even deserved her love. And that sacrifice changed everything. The audience was restless now, unable to sit comfortably because they could feel something massive was about to be revealed. Sundar stood quietly for a moment, his hands gripping the podium, his head lowered as if the memory itself weighed too much to carry. When he finally raised his eyes, there was a mixture of pride and pain in his face, a kind of expression that belongs only to someone who has lived through loss and gratitude at the same time. He said that while he was struggling in America, uncertain about his visa, drowning in the fear that his journey might end before it had even truly begun, Anjali had made a decision back in India without telling him. She had been offered a secure career opportunity, one that could have given her stability, recognition, and financial comfort. But she refused it silently. Instead, she chose to stay closer to his family, to be there for them in his absence, to make sure they did not feel the void of his leaving. Sundar's voice broke as he admitted he did not know this at the time. He thought she was living her life freely, but in truth, she was quietly stepping into the spaces he had left behind, carrying responsibilities that were never hers to carry. And then came the part that shook him the most. When Sundar's visa was on the edge of being denied, and the possibility of returning to India loomed large, Anjali secretly approached people, searched for options, and fought quietly on his behalf. She wrote letters to officials. She asked for guidance from people he never even knew she had reached out to. She did it all without telling him because she knew if he discovered it, he might feel guilty. He might see it as another burden. She protected him even from the knowledge of her own sacrifice. When Sundar learned about it years later after they were married, it nearly broke him. He said he could not understand how someone could give so completely, without asking for recognition, without needing applause, without even wanting him to know. That, Sundar whispered, his voice trembling, was when I realized that love is not measured in grand gestures, but in the unseen wars someone fights for you when you are too lost to fight for yourself. The audience was quiet, some wiping tears, others nodding in silent agreement, because they knew the truth of his words. Sundar continued, explaining that her sacrifice gave him strength, but it also left him feeling a deep responsibility. He told himself that he could never let her down again, that no matter how heavy the challenges, he would not allow fear to make him push her away or doubt the value of their journey. But even with this resolve, life was not done testing them. Sundar described how, when he finally secured his place in America, he often lived in near poverty. His scholarship covered part of his costs, but not all, and there were days when he survived on the cheapest food, when he chose between buying books or keeping his phone connection alive just to speak to her. He admitted that there were times when he questioned whether it was worth it, when exhaustion made the dream seem like a distant star. And then came another letter from Anjali, but this one was different. Instead of encouragement, instead of reminding him to endure, she confessed that people around her were beginning to question her choices. Friends whispered that she was wasting her youth waiting for someone who might never return. Relatives asked her why she tied her life to a man who could not even promise when he would come back. Her letter carried no anger, but between the lines, Sundar could feel the weight of her loneliness. His voice cracked as he said, "That was the first time I realized her sacrifice was not just about giving up opportunities. It was about standing alone, defending a dream she could not even touch, facing questions she could not answer while I was miles away. And the truth is, I almost lost her because of it." The crowd stirred uneasily. Sundar looked down, his expression heavy, and then he leaned closer to the microphone. "There was a day," he said slowly, "when she finally told me something I never thought I would hear. Words that cut me deeper than any struggle I faced in America. He stopped, the silence stretching unbearably. The audience leaned forward, waiting. Sundar's eyes glistened as he whispered, "She told me that if things continued this way, she might not be able to wait any longer." The room went completely still. No one moved, no one blinked. Sundar's face revealed the pain of that memory. And then he said softly, and it was at that moment, I knew I was on the verge of losing everything. Not just her, not just the dream, but the very reason I had chosen to fight it all. The screen behind him faded again to black, leaving only the sound of his breath in the microphone. And the story paused, hanging on the edge of heartbreak as everyone in the room silently wondered, what happened next? The silence that followed his last words was heavy, as though the entire auditorium carried the same weight that once pressed down on his chest. Sundar's voice softened when he returned, and this time, every sentence carried the texture of regret and memory. He said that when Anjali told him she might not be able to wait any longer, it was as if the earth beneath him had shifted. He had always thought of her as unshakable, as the one constant when everything else was uncertain, and now, for the first time, he realized how close he was to losing her. He described the night after that phone call, how he sat alone in his tiny room, staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to breathe properly. For hours he replayed her words, each one cutting him deeper. He thought of all the times she had stood silently for him, defended him, carried his dream as if it was her own, and how little he had given in return. He had been consumed with survival, with the next exam, the next challenge, the next step forward, and somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that her patience was not infinite. Sundar admitted he considered giving up his studies entirely. He imagined packing his bags, returning home, taking a stable job, and rebuilding their life together. He convinced himself that maybe dreams were selfish if they demanded this much pain, if they placed cracks in the heart of the person who believed in them most. But then he remembered her earlier words, the ones she had spoken before he ever left. If you give up on yourself, Sundar, you will lose me. The contradiction tore him apart. She had told him not to quit, and now she was telling him she might not be able to wait. He realized then that love is not a simple story where choices are clear. Sometimes love demands you carry two truths that fight against each other, and both are painful. He paused on stage, letting the weight of that realization sink into the audience. And then he revealed something unexpected. During those weeks of confusion, he did something he had never done before. He stopped writing letters. He thought maybe silence would protect them both. Maybe if he did not send words, if he did not confess his doubt or his guilt, then the distance between them would not grow wider. But silence can be louder than any sentence, and it began to erode their bond in ways he did not foresee. Anjali's next letter was shorter than all the ones before. Sundar remembered holding it in his hands, noticing the absence of her usual warmth, the absence of the lines that reminded him to be strong. Instead, it carried a single painful sentence. Sometimes I don't know who you are anymore. Sundar admitted his hands shook when he read it, because it was the first time she had ever questioned his identity, the first time she had allowed doubt to escape onto paper. The auditorium shifted uncomfortably, the audience feeling the sharp edge of his words. Sundar's voice grew even quieter, as though he was speaking not just to them but to the younger version of himself who had lived through that moment. He confessed that he almost broke then, almost surrendered everything, because the thought of her losing faith in him was more unbearable than failure itself. But just when the story seemed to collapse into despair, Sundar leaned into the microphone and said, "It was in that darkness that I discovered something about myself I had never known. Sometimes it is only when you are on the edge of losing everything that you find the courage to fight with a fire you didn't believe existed." He described how, in the weeks that followed, he began to change. Instead of isolating himself in guilt, he forced himself to reach out again, to write to her honestly, not with polished words but with raw truth. He admitted his fear, his struggles, his exhaustion. But he also reminded her of the promise they had once whispered to each other, that no matter how far apart, their lives were woven into one story. He told the audience that it was the hardest thing he had ever written, because it meant admitting weakness, something he had avoided for so long. Anjali's response to that letter was not immediate. He waited days, then weeks, his heart restless, wondering if his honesty had come too late. And then one morning an envelope arrived. When he opened it, her words poured out not as reproach but as something deeper. She wrote, "You think I wanted perfection, but what I wanted was your truth. I can endure distance, I can endure time, but I cannot endure silence. The audience erupted in quiet sighs, some visibly moved. Sundar's eyes softened as he said that was the moment he understood the real meaning of partnership. It was not about protecting her from his struggles. It was about sharing them even when they were heavy, even when they felt shameful. Because love, he realized, is not about hiding weakness, but about holding it together. Yet, even with this new understanding, Sundar told them, the story was far from over. He revealed that just when he thought things were beginning to stabilize, just when he believed they had found balance again, Anjali made a decision that would test him in a way he had never been tested before. Her choice, he said, was not to step away but to step closer, and it changed everything. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping so low the room felt smaller, more intimate, as if he was sharing a secret. She came to me unannounced, crossing oceans, leaving behind everything again. And when I saw her standing there, I realized that love has a strength that no distance, no struggle, and no silence can destroy. The audience gasped, the story twisting in a way they had not expected. But Sundar's face revealed that even this was not the end. With a heavy pause, he whispered, "What happened after that reunion nearly tore us apart again, because the truth she carried with her was something I was not prepared to hear." And once again, the lights dimmed, the cliffhanger cutting the story at its most fragile moment, leaving everyone desperate for what came next. The auditorium was trembling with anticipation. Everyone leaned forward as though 1,000 hearts were tied to Sundar's next sentence. His face carried both gratitude and sorrow, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had lived through storms and come out changed forever. He said that when Anjali arrived unannounced, after months of silence and doubt, he felt as though the universe had given him a second chance. He remembered standing frozen in the doorway of his small apartment, staring at her with disbelief. She had crossed oceans to be there, her eyes filled not with blame but with something far deeper, an unshaken determination. Sundar described that moment as both the most beautiful and the most terrifying of his life, because behind her smile, he sensed there was something she had not yet told him. The first hours of their reunion were filled with quiet joy. They walked the streets together, holding hands like they once had in their college days, laughing at small things, letting themselves forget, even briefly, the weight of distance and sacrifice. But as night fell and silence returned, Sundar noticed the way her hands trembled slightly, the way her eyes looked away when his lingered too long. Finally, when they were alone, she told him the truth she had carried across the ocean. Anjali confessed that her family had begun to lose patience with her choices. They had questioned her loyalty to a man who was thousands of miles away, a man who could not promise when he would return. Some even suggested that she was wasting her life, that her waiting was foolish, that she should move on. Sundar's throat tightened as he recalled her words. "They told me I was giving up everything for nothing, and for a moment, Sundar, I almost believed them." His voice cracked as he explained that this was the truth she had hidden, the truth that nearly broke him. She had doubted, not because her love had weakened, but because the pressure of carrying everyone else's disbelief had finally pierced her. Sundar said that when he heard this, he felt both rage and despair. Rage that anyone would question the woman who had given up so much for him, and despair that she had endured those voices alone, without his support. The audience sat in silence, some wiping away tears as Sundar went on. He told them that night he made a vow, not just to chase his dream, but to prove that her sacrifice had meaning. He swore that her belief in him would not end in emptiness, that the life they had both risked so much for would one day shine so brightly that no one could ever again call her choice foolish. But Sundar admitted that this vow was not born from ambition alone. It was born from love, from the deep realization that true partnership is not about one person carrying the other, but about both carrying each other through storms no one else can see. He described how, after that reunion, they began to rebuild differently. He stopped hiding his struggles. He wrote to her more often, not to impress her but to share his truth. She in turn began to write not only words of encouragement but also her fears, her exhaustion, her doubts. Together, they built a bridge of honesty, one that could hold the weight of oceans and time. Sundar told the audience that this was the turning point, the moment when their love matured from youthful promise into unshakable resilience. And then he revealed something no one expected. He said that years later, when he finally stood at the height of success, when the world knew his name and celebrated his rise, he looked into the crowd and searched for only one face, because all the applause, all the recognition, All the achievements meant nothing without the woman who had once been told she was sacrificing everything for nothing. The audience's eyes were fixed on him, and Sundar's voice grew softer, almost trembling. As he shared the words he whispered to her on the night he became CEO. We did it together. Every step was ours. And no matter what the world says, your sacrifice was never wasted. It became the foundation of everything. The auditorium erupted in silence again. Not the kind of emptiness that follows the end of a story, but the silence that comes when people are too moved to speak, when they are holding something heavy in their chest. Sundar looked out at them, his eyes glistening, and said his final words with a humility that reached deeper than any title or achievement. Respect is not about the positions we hold. Resilience is not about how far we climb. Kindness is not about what we give when it is easy. It is about the unseen battles, the sacrifices that no one claps for, the moments when love carries us forward, even when we cannot carry ourselves. I am here today not because of what I achieved, but because someone chose to believe in me when I did not believe in myself. That is the real story. He stepped back from the podium then, leaving the audience breathless. The lights dimmed, the stage empty, but the words lingered in the room like echoes that would not fade. Sundar's story had ended, but its truth stayed alive in the hearts of everyone who had listened, reminding them that behind every great success there is often a quiet, unseen sacrifice, and that love, respect, humility, and resilience are the real forces that change everything.